Before Europe began colonizing the New World, there were already Native Americans inhabiting the land, people groups with their own cultural identities, languages, and traditions. However, they were cast aside and nearly eliminated by colonists, stripped of their rights. While future acts like the Indian Citizenship Act gave Native people the title of citizen, it did little to make them citizens in reality. This led to the Native American Civil Rights Movement, a rather forgotten movement that helped define how the nation's leaders would responsibly treat those who went before us. It was about getting back the power to protect their cultures and to fight against a system that had worked to push them to the margins for decades. One of the first attempts to define the relationships between the U.S. government and the Native nations came in 1786 with the Hopewell Treaty, which recognized the land rights of Native tribes and also developed trade and peace agreements. As the U.S. expanded, the treaty system would eventually give way to more forceful policies that sought out control of Native peoples rather than negotiation with them, stripping them of their basic human rights. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act was signed into law by President Andrew Jackson. As Jackson saw it, the removal of tribes from their homelands to territories west of the Mississippi would enable both settlers and Native Americans to live free from conflict. However, the Indian Removal Act resulted in the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native people in what became known as the Trail of Tears, a journey riddled with death, disease, and suffering. But Jackson's policy of removal was only one part of his larger goal, to civilize Native peoples. In 1851, the United States government passed the Indian Appropriations Act that officially set aside lands to be given to Native tribes on reservations. However, little was given to Native Americans as a result of the land taken from them. Even while lining up by droves to fight for the United States during both the Civil War and the First World War, the country refused to take responsibility for their actions and give Native Americans their undeniable rights. This all changed in 1924. New York Representative Homer P. Snyder sponsored the Native American Citizenship Act, and it was signed into law by President Calvin Coolidge on June 2nd. This law legally recognized them as citizens of the United States for the first time. The shift in this direction was monumental, especially for those many tribes that had been denied this basic right for so long. However, the law did not guarantee voting rights. In many states, Native Americans were still barred from voting through state laws. Furthermore, citizenship was usually imposed without respect for Native sovereignty because the tribes remained under the jurisdiction of the federal government and their ways of life remained greatly restricted. The act also pointed out the complexities regarding political representation for Native Americans. One man who navigated these difficulties with skill was Charles Curtis, a man of Native American heritage who rose to become the first colored vice president under Herbert Hoover, serving from 1929 to 1933 through a combination of political skill and strategic alliances. Though he helped pass the Curtis Act, giving Congress full control of Native American lands, he eventually helped pass the Indian Citizenship Act. The 19th Amendment gave all U.S. citizens the right to vote, including women, but not Native Americans. By this time, they had been residing on reservations for over 80 years, yet U.S. citizens were virtually unaware of the horrible conditions that Native Americans faced daily. This was about to change. As an appreciation for their services during World War I, the United States government sanctioned a Merriam survey in 1928 on the status of reservation life. The report brought to light pressing need for reform, thus the creation of the Indian Reorganization Act aimed at restoring tribal sovereignty, self-government, and reversing land allotment. While it was a step forward, the actual implementation of the act had mixed results, and its actual impact unfolded over subsequent decades. Only about 160 tribes made their own constitutions under the provisions of the act, and their financial situations improved. This act sparked further controversy about the actual impact of the Indian Citizenship Act and ushered in calls for the Native American Civil Rights Movement. However, this thought had to be put on hold because of one world-shaking event, World War II. The United States was really struggling to gain momentum in World War II, and with this came the urgent need for secret communication. For this purpose, the U.S. military employed the Navajo Code Talkers, Native American soldiers who used the Navajo language to create an unbreakable code. It was with their ingenuity in encoding vital messages in a language unfamiliar to enemy forces that proved to be the turning tide of war in the Pacific.
Becoming a Navajo code talker was fraught with uncertainties. The road at times became very rough. You can't be afraid. It was the ancient, archaic language of the Navajo tribe.
The return to civilian life for Native Americans was quite difficult after this war. While their service during the war had been heroic in nature, Native Americans continued to face widespread discrimination, poverty, and often lacked access to basic educational and healthcare opportunities. Frustration and an ever greater sense of injustice by the mid-1960s provoked a renewed movement, beginning a new phase in the fight for equality. Many other civil reforms were taking place. Among them was the famous Civil Rights Movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. A few years later, on April 11, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Indian Civil Rights Act, which formally gave Native Americans the rights listed in the Bill of Rights. Problems with self-determination and sovereignty continued unchallenged, setting the stage for the birth of the American Indian movement, which would become a major player in Native activism. Created by Dennis Banks and Clyde Belcourt in Minneapolis that August, the movement had been founded to end racial discrimination and to make Native Americans' voices heard. One of AIM's greatest influences for future movements was the occupation of Alcatraz Island on November 20th, 1969. This lasted for a period of 19 months in which activists brought the issues of Native American rights, sovereignty, and broken treaties to the international stage. It ended on June 11, 1971, in a confrontation with federal authorities who removed by force the occupants. The boldness of the action furthered activism and advocacy of Native rights throughout the United States. That August, a group of Native American activists, including members of AIM, occupied Mount Rushmore to call to attention the U.S. government's lengthy history of broken treaties and general lack of concern for Native American rights. The Black Hills on which the monument stands are the most sacred of Lakota Sioux lands, and the occupation was a powerful protest against the government's seizure of this land. In response, federal authorities rapidly worked to evict their activists, evoking a sharp tension between governmental property rights and the incomplete rights of Native Americans.
Many Indians fear the government still won't let them run their own affairs.
I know that this is probably going to anger a few of you Uncle Tomahawks, or you sellouts, or you hang around the forts as it used to be called in the old days, and I really don't give a because I came down here to cause a little disturbance. The Crazy Horse and Geronimo and a few of these other great leaders we had could see the pathetic conditions we're living under today. I'm sure they would turn over in their grave.
But the largest and most significant move of AIM by far was the occupation at Wounded Knee of 1973. Members of AIM took over the village of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, to protest U.S. government failure to honor treaties. The occupation lasted for 71 days, drawing national attention to the struggles Native Americans continued to face and led to multiple deaths and injuries. The standoff drew more exposure to Native American problems but created some divisions within the movement and among Native communities. The occupation ended with a negotiated settlement, but the broader issues of Native sovereignty and the government's treatment of Native Americans remained unresolved. Just the following year, AIM leader Russell Means was arrested as a result of his connections to an ongoing protest held against the Bureau of Indian Affairs. His arrest symbolized the growing tension between Native American activists and the U.S. government, which was determined to silence dissent, while AIM continued to call to attention the mistreatment and racism against Native Americans. After Wounded Knee, the tide of American activism would rise to meet systemic oppression and the threat against indigenous sovereignty. In 1978, the longest walk took place. This 3,000-mile march from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. was a clear protest of various congressional bills designed to terminate Native rights. With nearly 200 participants, the walk gave visibility to the strength of Native unity and defeated the proposed legislation, securing important victories like the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. It has remained a powerful symbol of Native resistance and the struggle for justice and cultural survival. Despite such forward strides, many challenges in healthcare, educational, and land rights continue. Today, Native Americans are still on their quest for justice, but now with increasing power in national policy and attention to prevalent issues such as missing Indigenous women and the protection of cultural heritage. One major issue Native Americans experience today is blatant stereotyping via sports mascots. Major teams have been pressured to change their mascots, including the Washington Redskins and Cleveland Indians, because of their derogatory origins. On the contrary, some teams have been granted permission to maintain their names, such as the Florida State Seminoles. The Seminole people have granted permission for this to take place and have involved the university in shining a respectful and dignified light on their culture.
We want to be known as how we are today. We're living, we're breathing, we still have our culture, we still have our language, and we want to be looked at as Americans as well. And I think for some reason the American dream is that they forget about the Native Americans. I am Everett Osceola, and I am Seminole. All our traditions are passed down orally, like our songs, our stories, and our language. We've always been part of Florida. The only reason why we kind of disbanded is because when the Europeans came, it was kind of like, you guys belong here, you guys are going to be called this, you eat this certain type of food, so you're going to be called, you're going to be named after that food. So when we would go back and forth between Florida, when the Europeans came, we had to stick to one certain area in order to survive. When we came out of the swamps and when we were put on reservations, we weren't given that much. We were given maybe some water, maybe some commodities, but we had to live, we had to learn how to survive even in Hollywood. But we ended up learning from all the different resources that were around us, not only natural, but all the other different resources.
The Native American civil rights movement illustrates the relationship between rights and responsibility, to each other, to our land, and to future generations. From the mistreatment and silencing of the 1800s to the ongoing fight today for recognition and respect, this movement's legacy remains relevant and vital in shaping the quest for equality and dignity of all people. Native Americans' bravery and resilience remind us that the struggle for civil rights is not only a struggle of individuals, but also a struggle for the community, the nation, and our future as champions of the disempowered.